Ms. Escobar votes aye.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 16 noes.
The ayes have it. The resolution is amended as ordered, reported unfavorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the resolution will be reported as a single amendment in nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up HRES 1250, a resolution of inquiry directing the Secretary of Homeland Security to transmit certain documents to the House of Representatives relating to the impact of illegal immigration on federal or tribal lands for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the resolution unfavorably to the House. The clerk will report the resolution.
HRS 1250 of inquiry directing the
Without objection, the resolution is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. HRS 1250, introduced by Representative Blakemore, is a carbon copy of HRS 1249, except that it directs the Secretary of Homeland Security rather than the Secretary of the Interior to transmit to the House of Representatives certain documents relating to the impact of unauthorized immigration on federal or tribal lands. Instead of taking up any more of the committee's time on this, I would simply note that I oppose the resolution for the same reasons discussed in my previous opening statement, and I urge all members to report it unfavorably. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This resolution of inquiry directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to provide Congress with information related to the effect of illegal immigration on our environment, how drug cartels are trafficking narcotics on federal and tribal lands. Drug Enforcement Administration has assessed that Mexican drug traffickers remain the most serious drug trafficking threat in America as they continue to control smuggling pathways primarily across the southwest border. These Mexican drug cartel traffickers are also the main supplier of most illicit drugs available on reservations throughout tribal lands. This is made possible by the fact that Mexican drug traffickers take advantage of the Biden administration's weak border policies to not only illegally cross the border, but also traffic poisonous, illicit drugs like fentanyl. The Biden administration's border insecurity threatens every American community. Border Patrol agents are taken away from their jobs of protecting the border and preventing drug trafficking, and are forced to process aliens who cross the border illegally. Meanwhile, our country's drug crisis continues to spiral out of control. So far in fiscal year 2020, U.S. Customs and Border Protection has seized over 500,000 pounds of illicit drugs. These drug seizures include fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and marijuana. On August 30th, 2022, the DEA warned the public of a new trend of rainbow fentanyl targeting children and young people. The DEA and its law enforcement partners, quote, seized brightly colored fentanyl and fentanyl pills in 18 states, unquote, and stated, quote, this trend appears to be a new method used by drug cartels to sell highly addictive, potentially deadly fentanyl made to look like candy to children and young people. Meanwhile, our country's drug crisis continues to spiral out of control also. According to data from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, 93,655 fatal drug overdoses occurred in 2020, a nearly 30% increase over the prior year. In 2021, fatal drug overdoses increased to over 107,622 deaths, which represents a life lost every 5 minutes on average. Of those deaths, 71,238 were attributed to synthetic opioids, primarily illicit fentanyl. The requests for information in this ROI to the Department of Homeland Security are identical to those in the ROI to the Department of Interior. Importantly, the documents at both of these agencies are necessary to fully understand the devastating effects of the Biden administration's open border agenda. I urge support for this resolution and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Are there any other? Oh, I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HRS 12.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a single technical change to the resolution of inquiry by spelling the number 14 instead of using the actual number. No other changes are made to the resolution of inquiry. I urge all members to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Mr. Benz seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this will sound familiar since I just made this point concerning the last bill, but it's equally applicable here. And that is that the number of endangered and threatened Canada species like to be affected by the folks coming across the border, the million plus this year unapprehended, that type of impact absolutely should be taken into account and reported upon by the Department of Homeland Security. I should point out, and I didn't in my last set of remarks, that I've been to the border 3 times, and I've looked with the members of the Natural Resource Committee at the damage done by people entering and then tromping across grasses and through groves of trees, leaving garbage strewn here and there, and then goodness knows what sort of damage to the flora and fauna of the space. Why it's being ignored now by the environmental organizations that were so anxious to bring the possible danger to the environment that might come from the so-called Trump border wall. Why were they so anxious there? And yet here, the same 5 pages of endangered species are at risk, and we hear nothing, a deafening silence. It's another example, I think, of the double standard that's applied when it comes to folks that enjoy the positive view of our press and those that do not. I just want to mention that and again, I failed to mention the fact that the species with critical habitat along the border, not just where the wall might be, include such things as the San Bernardino spring snail, the Quino checker spot butterfly, the northern Mexican garter snake, the Mexican spotted owl, which brings me to a point. The spotted owl obviously is hugely important in Oregon, and in fact is responsible for shutting down the entire timber industry in Oregon, costing us hundreds of thousands of jobs and goodness knows how many lives ruined, driven to the very fentanyl that we're now hearing about coming across the border. It seems to me that we should be taking into account each and every one of these types of impacts. We're not, and why is beyond me. The approach that I used earlier, asking this be added to the record, I renew for this purpose, Mr. Chair. Please add this to the record, this 5 pages.
Without objection.
Thank you. And with that, I just want to mention, if the Bureau of Land Management was applying the same standards to people tromping across the desert that they apply in some of my district's uses of public land, this would have been stopped long ago, this kind of damage. And what I'm saying is, if you have the obligation to manage public land appropriately, you must submit to oversight by the Bureau of Land Management. Why wouldn't we be applying the same kind of standards to the type of impact these millions of people are having as they tromp across our federal lands? Doesn't make any sense, Mr. Chair. That I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? In that case, the question occurs on the amendment nature of a substitute. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is, the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, the amendment nature of a substitute is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the resolution HRS 1250 as amended unfavorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The ayes have it. Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
How did the chairman vote?
Aye.
I vote aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
Bass votes aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Dimmings?
Aye.
Ms. Dimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones? Ms. Ross?
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes
I'm
aye.
unrecorded.
Mr. Jordan?
I'm unrecorded.
Mr. Shabbat?
See, it's two different groups. And now they're not.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gohmert?
Nope.
Mr. Gohmert votes no. Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck?
This is huge.
No.
Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
No.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe?
It ain't his words.
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany?
No.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop?
No.
Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts?
No.
Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald?
No.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens?
No.
Mr. Owens votes no.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no.
Mr. Jeffries?
Mr. Jeffries votes yes.
Mr. Jeffries votes yes.
I'm unrecorded.
Ms.
I'm
Jackson
unrecorded.
Lee, you are not recorded.
Yes.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes yes.
Mr. Deutsch?
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report. Hold on. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu, you have to put your microphone on. Mr. Liu, we can't hear you. All right. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 20 ayes and 17 noes.
The ayes have it, and the resolution is amended as ordered reported unfavorably to the House.